A man sits in a paint shop, a book in his hand. He's muttering to himself as if he doesn't know you're there. Out of nowhere, as if he was in full conversation, he starts laughing. He stands up and says, "I'll be damned if I don't do it," and runs out of the shop. You buy some paint and go about your day. By lunchtime, everyone you know is talking about some crazy painter who tried to kill the president. Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. I'm Miles Fisher. Today we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson and the crazy-ass painter who tried to murder him. The story, as it's traditionally been told, is probably embellished to a certain degree, but even a dulled-down version has Andrew Jackson being, well, Andrew Jackson. So let's start with him. At the time of the assassination attempt in 1835, the first presidential assassination attempt in history, by the way, Jackson was well into his second term as president. Jackson himself is an interesting person to study. His story is basically that of a folk hero, minus the slave ownership and the Indian removal. From South Carolina, probably, Jackson's whole family, for the most part, died during the American Revolution. Regardless, he grows up to be a congressman, a senator, a judge, a lawyer, and a general in the War of 1812. That last one is where he becomes really famous for winning the Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815 after the War of 1812 ended in 1814. History's fun. Jackson has a long history of being a tough son of a gun. He has been in many fights, including several duels, one of which leaves him with a bullet in his chest from where he was shot when he was in his 30s. His nickname, Old Hickory, comes from him just being known as a hard man, but I also like to think it has something to do with his cane that he tends to walk around with. Very popular, Jackson becomes president in 1828. Through a conflict with himself as president, the state of South Carolina, and his then vice president, Crazy Eyes John C. Calhoun, Jackson nearly brings on civil war a little early when he threatens military action against South Carolina after they refuse to pay tariffs and threaten secession in what we now call the nullification crisis. The crisis is largely resolved by Henry Clay, a perpetual presidential loser, and one of the men Jackson beats out in 1828. But his relationship with many politicians really begins to sour. There are additional points of political conflict. One of them includes a bank, but we're going to talk about that one in a minute. By the time we get to 1835, Crazy Eyes Calhoun gives a speech in Washington, D.C., in which he reportedly says that Jackson was, quote, "a Caesar who ought to have a Brutus," end quote. We can all assume that Calhoun is not referring to when the two Romans used to bro out prior to the stabbings. This is where Richard Lawrence enters our story. In January of 1835, Richard Lawrence was an unemployed painter in D.C. He firmly believes the government owes him money, but he can't get the money, and the problem is Andrew Jackson. Jackson believed that the National Bank hurt the common man while simultaneously propping up the rich. Jackson vetoed congressional work on the bank, and the charter for it was set to expire. The first national bank was actually set up by Hamilton decades prior, but unlike Jackson, Hamilton dies in a duel like a bitch. Funny thing about this whole thing, though, is that both Hamilton and Jackson are actually on money. Hamilton's on the 10 and Jackson's on the 20, and I don't know how you get on a $20 bill having vetoed a national bank, but it's hilarious, so I kind of support it. Sorry, Harriet Tubman. Lawrence believes that Jackson is standing between him and the money the government owes him. He's obsessed with it. He may even have been present at a certain speech given by a Mr. Calhoun prior to that month in January. I should be clear, though, we don't actually know that Lawrence was there. What we do know is that Lawrence does start to tail Jackson's movement, at least according to a source that cited a book on Wikipedia. Apparently back in the 1830s, you just follow around the president like you're a bad private investigator that has a job on TV. Today, things are a little bit different. I once got in a traffic jam in Washington, D.C. because the president was somewhere near a road I was close to. Through his tailings of Jackson and his obsession, Lawrence figures out that Jackson's actually going to be at a congressional funeral on January 30th, and that is where our story gets interesting. It is a dreary and misty day. Lawrence had already been seen in the paint shop before heading over to the Capitol building, where a congressional funeral is being held. Lawrence waits for the 67-year-old president. He wants to shoot him on the way into the funeral. He sees the president. He can't get close. The president enters the Capitol. Lawrence decides to wait by a pillar on the east portico. As the president leaves the funeral, Lawrence sees his opportunity. He steps out and draws a Derringer pistol from his coat, aims at Jackson, and pulls the trigger. Nothing happens. The gun misfires. Jackson, noticing that someone is trying to kill him, doesn't run. He charges the man, cane in the air, yelling, quote, "Let me alone. I know where this came from," end quote. Lawrence, prepared, draws a second Derringer, aims at Jackson before he can reach him, and pulls the trigger. Again, nothing. Another misfire. There is no third pistol and no time to run. Old Hickory reaches Lawrence and starts beating him with his cane. A witness to the event wrote a letter to his wife. Quote, "He behaved most gallantly upon the occasion, and if he had not been jerked back by his friend, would have probably knocked the second pistol out of the fellow's hand by striking his arm with a cane, and would have laid him out by another blow over the head." End quote. Jackson is pulled off his would-be assassin, and Lawrence arrested before being taken to jail. One of the men who actually helped to subdue Lawrence was Davy Crockett, who will die 1 year later at the Alamo. We'll get back to Lawrence here in a little bit, but an assassination attempt just happened on the president. There's not surprisingly some confusion, and Jackson himself gets a little bit paranoid. Remember that about a month before this, John C. Calhoun gave a speech suggesting that someone in fact should kill Jackson. Because of that, Jackson believes that Lawrence was probably hired by some of his political opponents in the Whig Party. The Whigs, not to be outdone by some damn Democrat, actually suggest that Jackson staged the whole thing to gain sympathy from the people. To dispel any suspicion, Calhoun declares his innocence on the Senate floor, a place where no politician can lie. George Poindexter, a Mississippi senator, is also under suspicion. He is known for having opposed Jackson, and it just so happened that the year prior, in 1834, a certain Richard Lawrence painted Poindexter's house. Imagine that coincidence makes some conversations with your Whig buddies a little bit awkward. Man, want to talk about how much we hate Jackson? Hey, didn't that Lawrence guy paint your house? I didn't know much about Poindexter before researching this episode. I was really hoping that the term for like a nerdy, bookwormy guy came from Poindexter, but that's actually not the case. Apparently, it comes from an animated TV series called Felix the Cat that aired in 1959 through 1962. So, no luck on that front. Poindexter actually had nothing to do with the assassination, probably. But he does lose re-election because this scandal does not look good. In reality, unlike Oswald, Richard Lawrence in all likelihood worked alone. No conspiracy needed when you live in a time that you can just kind of follow the president around from place to place, assuming that your guns work and you're outside of caning distance. But if this whole thing wasn't a conspiracy, then, well, what drove Lawrence over the edge? Was it just that the government may have owed him money, or was it something else? Well, it turns out Lawrence is probably just crazy. Our plucky painter had been working with the substance for a long time. And back in the 1930s, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there weren't exactly high standards for, safe working materials. Some of the substances in paint may not have been great for your brain. I don't know exactly what was in paint in the 1830s, but I do know that lead wasn't taken out of paint until 1978. I would like to imagine our boy was just sipping on some tasty, tasty blue, and eventually his mush brain came to some delusions. For example, in the trial it came out that Lawrence believed that Jackson killed his father. Jackson is responsible for killing a lot of people, so it doesn't sound super far-fetched, but this is untrue. More interesting, Lawrence believed that he was British royalty. Obviously a little bit tougher to get on board with this one. To be specific, he believed that he was King Richard III. The problem with him being King Richard III was that King Richard III was an English king who died nearly 400 years before this. But he was named Richard, so I can see why he'd get confused. As a kid, in a play about pilgrims, I once played Miles Standish. I never drank enough paint, though. So whenever I pretend to be a Puritan, I don't usually burn people I suspect of being witches. Finally, as British royalty, Lawrence also believed that he was entitled to payments from the American colonies. Colonies, which, as you know, were his rightful property. Jackson, putting an end to the National Bank, obviously had to die. After Jackson died, Martin Van Buren would take office as president. He could reestablish the bank, and then our boy Richie would get paid. This is actually the reason why Lawrence was unemployed. He had quit his job, and he had told his sisters that he quit his job because, as king, the country owed him money. Come time for the trial, it wasn't very hard for the defense to prove that Lawrence was crazy. He had grown increasingly aggressive with his family for years. He had told his sisters that he felt that he was king, and there were even kids in his neighborhood who would make fun of him by running around calling him King Richard. He also behaved very strangely at the trial. In an article written by Robert Brammer, he writes, quote, Lawrence even dressed the part of royalty at trial, sporting a shooting jacket and cravat. He also expressed some indignation at the fact that he was judged by commoners. After the jury was instructed, Lawrence had the last word, stating, "It is for me, gentlemen, to pass upon you. and not you upon me, end quote. I'm sure the prosecuting attorney found this strange. I have no real reason to bring that up, other than I want to tell you that the prosecuting attorney was actually Francis Scott Key, just in case you want to know what he's been up to since his songwriting career ended. When the jury's finally sat down to deliberate, it takes them all of 5 minutes to come back with a verdict. Lawrence is found not guilty by reason of insanity. He then lives out his days in a mental asylum. In an alternate universe, he actually escapes the asylum and becomes the Joker. But in ours, he doesn't, and he dies in 1861. Historically, he's left with a Wikipedia page with his name followed by the words failed assassin, and it repeatedly makes note that he is unemployed. The last thing I want to bring up before closing this episode is just how close history was to being different. 2 pistols misfired at close range, both would have killed the 67-year-old Jackson. After the assassination attempt, both pistols were examined, and both were found to be in fine working order. In fact, according to Senator Thomas Hart Benton, they were, quote, fired afterwards without fail, carrying their bullets true and driving them through inch bores at 30 feet, end quote. I really enjoyed that investigations at the time consisted of senators just going out and shooting guns. It's probably still that way in Texas. The Smithsonian cites an arms expert who claims that the odds of these 2 guns misfiring successfully was something like 1 in 125,000 to 1. I don't know how accurate those odds are, but either way, the odds are astronomically low. The story propels an already popular Jackson to mythical status as divine intervention can be added to the list of reasons the man can't be stopped. In reality, the reason the pistols probably misfired is because it was wet that morning. Dreary, misty, and humid. After Jackson enters the funeral, Lawrence has to wait, and as he does, his guns, already loaded, wait with him. When Jackson exits, they no longer function, and the course of American history takes its path. It's a fun story.